The flight was running smoothly until a flight attendant stopped beside an elderly black couple in first class. Her voice was sharp, her stance firm. "I need to see your tickets." Confused but calm, the husband handed them over. She barely glanced before shaking her head. "These seats are reserved for paying passengers." Passengers turned, whispering, sensing tension. The wife exhaled slowly, her voice steady. "We paid." But the flight attendant wasn't listening. With a smirk, she called security. What she didn't know? The couple owned the airline, and what happened next? No one on that plane was ready for it. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new one. The cabin was calm as passengers settled into their seats. The soft hum of the engines filled the air, while flight attendants moved through the aisles, checking seatbelts and offering polite smiles. Among the travelers, an elderly black couple, Otis Bennett and his wife Evelyn Bennett, sat comfortably in the first-class section. Otis adjusted his reading glasses, glancing at the newspaper he had brought along, while Evelyn neatly folded a silk scarf into her lap. They had traveled thousands of times before, but even after all these years, they still enjoyed the quiet luxury of first class. Heather Connors, a flight attendant dressed in a crisp navy blue uniform, walked through the cabin with a confident stride. Her eyes swept over the passengers, her gaze stopping when she noticed the elderly couple. A slight frown crossed her face as she approached them. She leaned down slightly, her voice firm but forced into politeness. "Excuse me, but I need to check your tickets." Otis looked up, slightly surprised, but without hesitation. He reached into his pocket and handed over their first-class boarding passes. Evelyn watched Heather carefully, her expression unreadable. Heather scanned the tickets quickly, then let out a small breath. "These must be a mistake," Heather said, shaking her head. "First class is reserved for paying passengers." Otis raised an eyebrow but remained calm. "That is correct," he replied in a steady voice. "We paid for these seats." Heather barely concealed her disapproval. She glanced around, aware that other passengers were now listening. Some were pretending not to notice, while others openly observed the exchange. "I'll need you to step aside while I verify this with the front desk," she said, her voice carrying a sharpness that hadn't been there before. Evelyn, who had been silent, finally spoke. "Why?" Her voice was soft, but there was strength in it. "You have our tickets right there. What exactly needs to be verified?" Heather's smile thinned. "I just need to confirm that everything is in order." Otis exchanged a glance with Evelyn. He could see it in her eyes. She knew exactly what this was. They had seen it before, felt it before, even when dressed in their finest clothes, even when they had the same privileges as everyone else in the room. "I understand," Otis said, though his tone was unreadable. He carefully folded his newspaper and placed it on the tray table in front of him. He wasn't going to argue. He wasn't going to plead. But he wasn't going to make this easy for her either. Heather stood there, waiting for them to gather their things, but neither of them moved. A flicker of frustration passed across her face. She straightened, adjusting her uniform, then turned on her heel and marched toward the front of the plane. The silence that followed was thick. A few rows away, a businessman, Raymond Wells, glanced at them, then quickly looked away. A woman, Isla Carter, sitting with her toddler, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Nobody said anything. Nobody wanted to get involved. Evelyn let out a slow breath. "Here we go again," she murmured. Otis reached for her hand and gave it a gentle squeeze. "Let's see how far she takes it." At the front of the plane, Heather picked up the intercom phone and spoke in hushed tones with David Langley, another senior flight attendant. David listened, his brows furrowing as Heather explained the situation. "A couple in first class. I don't think they belong there," she whispered. David glanced toward the cabin, spotting Otis and Evelyn. He hesitated. Something about Heather's tone didn't sit right with him. "Did you check the passenger manifest?" Heather stiffened. I don't need to. I'm sure it's a mistake. David sighed, sensing trouble. Heather, you should always check first. But Heather wasn't listening. She turned her attention back to the intercom, signaling for assistance. A moment later, a uniformed security officer, Mark Grayson, entered the cabin. His presence alone was enough to send a ripple of discomfort through the first-class passengers. Otis and Evelyn didn't flinch. They remained seated, waiting, watching. It was only a matter of time before the truth would come out. But by then, it would already be too late. Heather felt a surge of satisfaction as she stepped aside to let Security Officer Mark Grayson handle the situation. She folded her arms, watching as he approached Otis and Evelyn's seats. Mark, a tall man with a no-nonsense demeanor, cleared his throat before speaking. "Sir, ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to come with me to clear up a seating issue." Otis adjusted his glasses, his expression calm. "A seating issue?" he repeated. "Our tickets are right here." Mark hesitated for a brief moment before looking over at Heather. She nodded, silently encouraging him to push forward. "This is just protocol," Mark continued, though his voice lacked confidence now. "If you'll follow me, we can straighten this out at the front." Evelyn didn't move. She simply stared at Mark, her expression unreadable. "We are elderly," she said slowly. "You're asking us to stand up, gather our things, and walk all the way to the front of the plane because this woman," she flicked her eyes toward Heather, "refuses to believe we belong here?" Mark shifted uncomfortably. He had handled difficult passengers before, but this felt different. The couple was composed, dignified. They weren't causing trouble. They weren't arguing. And yet, the flight attendant was standing there, arms crossed as if she had already made up her mind about them. Heather let out an exaggerated sigh. "It's a simple request. If there's no mistake, they can come back to their seats after verification." Otis exhaled, his patience thinning. "If there's no mistake, we shouldn't have to move in the first place." Passengers nearby began whispering among themselves. A few side glances were exchanged, but no one spoke up. A younger woman, Isla Carter, held her toddler closer, shifting in her seat as if the tension in the air made her uncomfortable. Raymond Wells, the businessman, tapped his fingers against his armrest, looking straight ahead as though ignoring the problem would make it disappear. David Langley, the senior flight attendant, stood near the front of the cabin, watching. His gut told him something was off. He had worked with Heather before. She was efficient, but she had a habit of making assumptions. He had let things slide in the past, but this was turning into something much bigger. Otis slowly picked up his newspaper again. "We will not be moving," he said simply. Heather narrowed her eyes. "Then I'll have to insist." Evelyn folded her arms, her voice unwavering. "And I'll have to refuse." Mark inhaled, torn between his duty and the uneasy feeling crawling up his spine. "Sir, please." Otis turned his gaze to the security officer, his tone still calm but carrying undeniable authority. "Son, you might want to call your supervisor before you make a decision you regret." Mark blinked. His supervisor? Why would they need to involve? Heather scoffed, rolling her eyes. "This is getting ridiculous." But Mark hesitated. Something about Otis's words didn't sit right with him. He knew there was something he was missing. He took a step back, reaching for his radio. Heather's confidence faltered for the first time. "Why are you calling your supervisor?" she demanded. Mark didn't answer. Instead, he pressed the button on his radio. "This is Officer Grayson requesting clearance to remove 2 first-class passengers. Can I get verification on their status?" Static filled the line for a moment. Then a voice came through. "Stand by. We're checking the manifest now." Otis and Evelyn remained seated, their faces composed. Heather, on the other hand, suddenly felt a nervous flutter in her stomach. And then, after a few tense seconds, the voice returned. "Officer Grayson, do not remove those passengers. Repeat, do not remove those passengers under any circumstances. We're sending someone to handle this." Mark's head snapped up. "What?" Heather's arms dropped to her sides. "What do you mean, do not remove them?" Mark turned toward the couple, studying them now with fresh eyes. Otis held his gaze steadily while Evelyn simply smoothed her scarf, as if all of this was beneath her. Heather's face paled. Something was very, very wrong, and she had no idea what was about to happen next. Heather's stomach twisted as she watched Officer Grayson lower his radio, his expression shifting from firm to cautious. He glanced toward Otis and Evelyn again, as if seeing them in a new light. The message from the control desk had been clear. These two were not to be removed under any circumstances. But why? Heather forced a tight smile, trying to regain control of the situation. There must be some mistake. I asked you to remove them because they're sitting in the wrong seats. Otis let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. Young lady, the only mistake here is your assumption. Mark hesitated. He had been in security long enough to know when he was caught in something bigger than himself. He wasn't going to make a move until he understood exactly what was happening. He tapped his radio again. Control, what's the situation with these passengers? The response was almost immediate. Stand by, Officer Grayson. You have incoming personnel. Do not act until further instructions. Heather's throat tightened. Incoming personnel? What does that mean? Passengers around them were starting to pick up on the tension. The whispers grew louder. Isla Carter clutched her toddler a little closer, looking between the flight attendant and security with a worried expression. Raymond Wells, the businessman, pulled out his phone, subtly tilting it in a way that suggested he was recording. David Langley, the senior flight attendant, finally stepped forward. His voice was calm but firm. Heather, maybe we should take a step back and figure out what's going on before we escalate this any further. Heather shot him a sharp glare. I'm following protocol. David folded his arms. No, you're making a scene over something that should have been verified before you even approached them. Heather ignored him, turning her attention back to Mark. If there's an issue, why aren't we just removing them until we get an answer? Otis exhaled, a slight smile playing at the edge of his lips. You're determined, aren't you? Heather clenched her jaw. I'm doing my job. Evelyn tilted her head slightly. Are you? Before Heather could fire back a response, movement at the front of the plane caught everyone's attention. The curtain separating first class from the entrance swayed, and a man in a sharp navy blue suit stepped into the cabin. His presence alone demanded attention. Nathan Calloway, the airline's regional director, had just boarded the plane. Heather's breath hitched. David immediately straightened, recognizing his superior. Mark took a slight step back, waiting for instruction. The murmurs in the cabin grew as passengers sensed that whatever was happening was much bigger than they had originally thought. Nathan's eyes scanned the first-class section before landing on Otis and Evelyn. The moment he saw them, his expression shifted from composed to slightly tense. He moved toward them swiftly, stopping just beside Mark. Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Bennett. His voice was controlled but carried clear authority. Is there a problem here? Heather's breath caught. He knew them. Otis leaned back slightly, folding his hands over his lap. Well, Nathan, he said smoothly, you tell me. Your flight attendant here seems to believe my wife and I don't belong in our seats. Nathan inhaled sharply, his jaw tightening. He turned his head slowly toward Heather. His gaze was unreadable, but there was something dangerous behind his eyes. Is that so? Heather felt her stomach drop. The tension in the cabin was now thick enough to cut with a knife. Passengers were staring openly, waiting, watching. Nathan spoke again, his voice measured. I'd like to hear exactly what happened. From the beginning. Heather swallowed hard. For the first time, she had the unsettling feeling that she was no longer in control of this situation. And from the way Nathan was looking at her, she knew. She had just made the biggest mistake of her career. Heather felt a cold sweat creeping up her neck as Nathan Calloway's sharp gaze remained locked onto her. Her mouth felt dry, but she forced herself to speak. I was just ensuring that first-class seating was reserved for the proper passengers. Nathan's expression didn't change. And what made you think Mr. and Mrs. Bennett weren't proper passengers? Heather's throat tightened. The way he said it sent a clear message. She had already lost this argument. but she wasn't ready to back down completely. She glanced at Mark, hoping for some kind of support, but the security officer looked just as unsure as she was now. I requested to verify their seats because... She hesitated, trying to choose her words carefully. Because I've seen people try to sneak into first class before. I was just following protocol. Otis let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. Protocol, he repeated, like the word itself amused him. He turned his gaze to Nathan. Didn't realize we had such strict security measures for passengers who already presented their tickets. Nathan ignored the comment, keeping his attention on Heather. His voice was steady, but there was no mistaking the steel underneath it. Did you check the manifest before asking them to move? Heather stiffened. I didn't think it was necessary. David Langley sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. That's exactly what I told you to do. Nathan exhaled slowly, nodding once. So, you didn't check the manifest. You didn't verify the ticket beyond a glance. You didn't contact the gate crew. You assumed they didn't belong here and called security instead. Heather's face burned. The way he was laying it out made it sound so wrong. But wasn't she just doing her job? Wasn't she keeping order? Evelyn finally spoke, her voice soft but cutting. Tell me something, Miss Connors. How many other first-class passengers did you ask for proof? Heather's eyes flickered around the cabin. She felt like she was shrinking under their stares. None. She hadn't asked a single other passenger. She opened her mouth, trying to come up with some kind of explanation, but Nathan spoke first. His voice carried quiet authority, the kind that made people listen. Miss Connors, let me make something very clear, he said. These two passengers, Mr. and Mrs. Bennett, are not just first-class passengers. They are not just paying customers. He let the words hang in the air for a second. The cabin was so silent that the sound of the plane's engines was the only thing filling the space. Nathan turned toward Otis and Evelyn, then took a slight step back, a show of respect. These two, he continued, own this airline. Gasps rippled through the cabin. Heather felt like the ground had been ripped from under her feet. She stared at them, her breath catching in her throat. That couldn't be true. Otis leaned back in his seat, crossing his legs. He didn't look smug. He didn't even look angry. He just looked disappointed. Evelyn adjusted her scarf, shaking her head slightly. Such a shame, she murmured. All these years in service, and you still don't know who signs your paycheck. Heather's vision blurred for a second. The weight of her mistake crushed down on her chest. Nathan's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts. Miss Connors, you are relieved of duty for the remainder of this flight. You will be met by a supervisor upon landing to discuss further disciplinary action. Heather's heart pounded in her chest. Wait, I was just trying to... Nathan held up a hand, silencing her. Enough. Mark Grayson took a step closer, as if preparing to escort her away. The entire first-class section was still watching, but now there was no sympathy in their gazes. Heather had been so certain of her authority just minutes ago. Now, she had none left. Her career was slipping through her fingers, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Heather's pulse pounded in her ears as she stood frozen in place. The weight of every eye in the first-class cabin pressed down on her. Just moments ago, she had been the one in control, the one giving orders. Now she was the one being ordered around. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. She wanted to argue, to defend herself, to somehow undo the damage. But what could she say? That she hadn't meant to offend them? That she had been following some unspoken rule? No excuse would change the fact that she had humiliated the owners of the airline in front of an entire cabin full of witnesses. Nathan Calloway gave her a long, steady look before speaking again. Miss Connors, step aside. Now. Heather swallowed the lump in her throat and forced her feet to move. She stepped back, her body stiff, her hands clenched at her sides. Mark Grayson, the security officer, didn't even have to touch her. She already knew she had lost. Otis exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. Imagine that, he said quietly. kicked off our own flight. Evelyn adjusted her posture, smoothing the wrinkles from her dress. I wonder if she would have done the same if we looked a little different. Heather flinched at the words. Her skin prickled with the weight of what she had done. Had she really made her judgment based on that? Passengers were still whispering, some stealing quick glances in her direction before looking away, embarrassed. Isla Carter, the young mother, bounced her child on her lap and muttered something under her breath that sounded like, "Serves her right." Heather's gaze flicked toward Raymond Wells, the businessman who had been watching the whole time. He was now openly recording, his phone angled slightly as he captured every second of her downfall. She wanted to scream. She wanted to snatch his phone away and demand that he delete it. But she couldn't, because she had no power anymore. Nathan turned back to Otis and Evelyn. His voice softened slightly as he spoke to them. "Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Bennett, I sincerely apologize for this situation. This is not how we treat our most valued passengers." Evelyn gave a polite nod, though the sharpness in her eyes didn't fade. "Oh, I know, Nathan. But clearly, some of your staff don't." Nathan's jaw tightened. He knew she was right. He turned toward David Langley, the senior flight attendant. "Take over for Miss Connors. Make sure Mr. and Mrs. Bennett are as comfortable as possible for the rest of this flight." David gave a quick nod. "Of course, sir." Heather's heart sank further. That was supposed to be her job. Nathan stepped away, reaching for his phone. "I have to make a few calls. When we land, we'll be having a very serious discussion about Miss Connors' future with this airline." Heather felt the blood drain from her face. Her future? Evelyn picked up her silk scarf and wrapped it loosely around her shoulders, then turned her gaze back to Heather. "I do hope you learned something from this," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Because next time you might not be so lucky." Heather's breathing grew unsteady. Nathan gestured toward the galley. "Miss Connors, go. Now." Heather's feet felt like lead as she turned and walked toward the back of the cabin. The murmurs grew louder as she passed by the passengers who had just witnessed her humiliation. She had spent years building her reputation, years commanding respect, and in a matter of minutes, she had lost it all. But something told her this was only the beginning of her downfall. Heather's steps felt heavier with each passing moment. She kept her head down as she walked toward the galley, feeling the weight of the passengers' stares pressing into her back. She could hear the murmurs, the quiet whispers of judgment. A few seats down, Raymond Wells still had his phone angled, subtly recording everything. Isla Carter, the young mother, shook her head as if she had just witnessed something shameful. Heather clenched her jaw, swallowing the bitterness rising in her throat. She had never felt this exposed, this humiliated. As she reached the galley, she gripped the counter, her fingers trembling. The space felt smaller than before, as if the walls were closing in on her. David Langley stepped in behind her, his voice quiet but firm. "You really messed up, Heather." Heather snapped her head up, her voice sharper than she intended. "I was just doing my job." David exhaled, crossing his arms. "No, you were making assumptions, and now you're facing the consequences." Heather's eyes burned. "So that's it? I'm just supposed to take the blame and disappear?" David studied her for a long moment before shaking his head. "Heather, do you even hear yourself? You kicked the owners of this airline out of their seats. You didn't just mess up, you turned this flight into a spectacle." Heather's hands curled into fists at her sides. "I didn't know who they were." David arched an eyebrow. "And if they weren't the owners, would it have made a difference?" That question hit her harder than she expected. She opened her mouth to respond but found no words. Because deep down, she already knew the answer. David didn't push further. He simply shook his head. "You should start thinking about what you're going to say when we land. Because I guarantee you, Nathan Calloway isn't the only one waiting for you." Heather pressed her back against the counter, her breath shaky. She wanted to believe this would blow over, that a simple apology would fix things, but the sinking feeling in her stomach told her otherwise. Meanwhile, back in the first-class cabin, Otis adjusted his reading glasses and casually reopened his newspaper, as if nothing had happened. Evelyn, on the other hand, leaned back in her seat, her fingers tapping lightly against the armrest. David returned to their seats, his posture more respectful than before. "Is there anything I can get for you, Mr. and Mrs. Bennet?" Evelyn lifted a brow. "Now you ask?" David hesitated, then nodded. "I suppose I deserve that." Otis waved a hand dismissively. "We'll be fine. Just make sure the rest of your staff is aware that we don't plan on being interrupted again." David gave a quick nod before stepping away. The tension in the cabin hadn't fully faded. Passengers were still glancing at the Bennets, some embarrassed, some clearly impressed by the quiet power they had just witnessed. Heather might have been the one who made the mistake, but she wasn't the only one left uncomfortable by the way things had played out. Otis turned to his wife with a small smirk. "You think they'll remember us next time?" Evelyn chuckled softly, picking up her tea. "Oh, I think they'll never forget." As the plane cruised through the sky, Heather remained in the galley, gripping the counter as she stared blankly at the wall. She wasn't sure what awaited her when they landed, but she had a terrible feeling. She wasn't going to like it. The flight continued smoothly, but for Heather, the hours felt like an eternity. She remained in the galley, away from the first-class cabin, her mind racing. Her uniform suddenly felt too tight, her throat dry. She had faced difficult passengers before, had handled complaints and uncomfortable situations, but nothing had ever spiraled out of control like this. The reality of what had just happened settled over her like a suffocating weight. She had humiliated the owners of the airline. She could still hear Evelyn's voice in her head, sharp and unshaken. "All these years in service and you still don't know who signs your paycheck." Heather clenched her fists, trying to shake off the memory. Maybe when they landed, she could talk to Nathan Calloway privately, explain herself. Maybe she could convince him that this was a misunderstanding. But deep down, she knew. There was no fixing this. A soft shuffle of footsteps broke her thoughts. David Langley stepped into the galley, his expression unreadable. He studied her for a moment before finally speaking. "You should prepare yourself." Heather's stomach tightened. "For what?" David sighed, leaning against the counter. "I just got off the phone with ground operations. The executive board already knows what happened." Mr. Bennet made a call mid-flight. Heather's breath caught in her throat. He called the board?" David nodded. "And from what I heard, they're not happy." Heather's fingers dug into the counter. This wasn't just about an incident report or a slap on the wrist. This was career-ending. She forced herself to stay composed. "I'll explain myself. I'll tell them I was just enforcing policy." David scoffed. "Policy?" He shook his head. "Heather, you didn't enforce policy. You made a judgment call, a bad one." Heather's jaw tightened. "So, that's it? I lose everything over one mistake?" David gave her a pointed look. "One mistake?" "No, Heather. This wasn't a mistake. This was a choice." Heather's chest tightened. David didn't wait for her response. He straightened his uniform and turned to leave. "We land in 40 minutes. I'd think about what you're going to say when you step off this plane." Heather remained frozen in place, her mind spinning. 40 minutes. That was all the time she had left before her fate was decided. Back in first class, Otis casually flipped through the pages of his newspaper while Evelyn took a sip of her tea. Neither of them looked rattled. They had dealt with situations like this before. The only difference: this time there would be consequences. Passengers around them still stole occasional glances, some clearly uncomfortable with how quickly things had changed. Raymond Wells, the businessman, was still scrolling through his phone, likely checking to see if his recording had captured every detail of the incident. Isla Carter, the young mother, had stopped whispering and was now watching Evelyn with something close to admiration. David returned to their row, clearing his throat. "Mr. and Mrs. Bennet, just letting you know that everything is being handled. I'm very sorry this happened." Otis gave a small nod, not bothering to look up. "Good. Let's make sure it doesn't happen again." Evelyn set her cup down, glancing toward the front of the cabin. And what about her? David hesitated. Miss Connors will be dealt with after landing. Evelyn hummed in acknowledgement, tapping her nails lightly against the tray table. I wonder, she mused, if she realizes just how much she's lost. David didn't answer, because they both knew the truth. Heather Connors had no idea how bad this was going to get. The cabin remained eerily quiet as the plane began its descent. The usual excitement that came with landing was missing. No cheerful chatter, no casual stretching of limbs. Instead, there was an undeniable tension, one that even those who had tried to ignore the earlier confrontation couldn't escape. Heather sat alone in the galley, gripping the edge of the counter. The minutes felt like a countdown to disaster. She had spent years enforcing rules, maintaining order, and ensuring passengers respected airline policies. But now she was the one being disciplined. A soft knock against the galley wall made her snap out of her spiraling thoughts. Mark Grayson, the security officer, stood there, his face unreadable. "They're sending someone to meet you when we land," he said simply. Heather inhaled sharply. "Who?" Mark sighed. "An executive from the board, and Mr. Bennett." Heather's stomach lurched. Otis Bennett wasn't just lodging a complaint. He was personally going to be there when she stepped off the plane. Her hands began to tremble. I didn't think it would go this far." Mark folded his arms, studying her for a moment. "You really didn't, did you?" Heather's head shot up, her temper flaring. "I was doing my job," Mark scoffed, shaking his head. "No, you were making assumptions." He leaned in slightly, his voice lower. "You saw them sitting in first class and thought they didn't belong. You didn't check the manifest. You didn't verify their names. You just decided they were out of place." Heather's mouth opened, but she had no defense, because he was right. Mark took a step back. "If I were you, I'd start thinking about what I'm going to say when I step off this plane. Because this isn't just about losing a job, Heather." His voice darkened. "This is about losing everything you thought you had control over." Heather clenched her jaw, but she couldn't argue with him. She was losing control. She had already lost it. Meanwhile, back in first class, Otis and Evelyn sat quietly as the flight crew made the final descent announcements. The captain's voice was smooth over the intercom, but even he couldn't erase the tension that hung in the air. Otis glanced toward the window, watching as the city lights stretched beneath them. Evelyn, on the other hand, kept her eyes on the front of the cabin. She could feel the shift. People who had been indifferent before were now overly polite. The flight attendants, especially David, made sure not to let them wait even a second longer than necessary. Isla Carter, the young mother, hesitated before finally speaking. "Mrs. Bennett?" Evelyn turned to her with a polite expression. "Yes?" Isla swallowed, adjusting her toddler in her lap. I wanted to say I'm sorry for what happened. I know it wasn't my place to step in, but I should have." Evelyn studied her for a moment, then offered a small smile. "You noticed it was wrong. That's more than most people did." Isla let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Otis glanced at her, his tone gentle. "Next time you see something like this, don't wait for someone else to speak up. Do it yourself." Isla nodded, as if those words carried more weight than she had expected. The plane gave a slight jolt as the wheels touched the runway. Passengers straightened in their seats, some out of habit, others because they were waiting. They were waiting to see what would happen next. Heather, still in the galley, gripped the counter so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her heart pounded as she heard the captain's final announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our destination. Please remain seated as we taxi to the gate. On behalf of our crew, we'd like to thank you for flying with us today." Heather exhaled shakily. She had never dreaded landing before, but this time, she wasn't sure if she'd ever step on a plane again. The plane slowly taxied to the gate, but for Heather, every second felt stretched into eternity. The once familiar sounds of the landing process, the hum of the engines winding down, the clicking of seatbelts being unfastened, the rustling of passengers gathering their belongings, felt distant, Her focus remained locked on what awaited her outside this aircraft. In the first-class cabin, Otis placed his reading glasses into his coat pocket and adjusted his watch, completely at ease. Evelyn straightened her scarf, glancing toward the front of the plane where the cabin door would soon open. Neither of them spoke, but their quiet presence alone sent a message. This wasn't over. Heather could hear David speaking with passengers, maintaining professionalism despite the tension lingering in the air. She envied his composure. She didn't have any left. A sharp ding signaled that the doors were being unlocked. The jet bridge connected. Heather's breath hitched. Then a new voice filled the cabin. Not from the intercom, not from the flight crew. Nathan Calloway. "Ladies and gentlemen, I ask that you remain seated for just a few moments while we address a situation before disembarkation." Passengers exchanged glances. Some whispered. Others, including Raymond Wells, kept their phones ready. Heather's stomach twisted. Footsteps echoed from the entrance of the plane, slow and deliberate. She knew who they belonged to before she even looked. Otis Bennett was standing at the front of the cabin. His presence alone silenced the murmurs. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The authority in his posture, the weight of his name was more than enough. Evelyn stood beside him, poised, her expression unreadable. Heather shrank back into the galley. She wasn't ready for this. Nathan stepped forward, clearing his throat. His voice was professional, but his words were final. "Heather Connors, please step forward." Heather's entire body locked up. She couldn't move. David, who had been standing nearby, gave her a quiet look. He didn't need to say anything. She had no choice. Forcing herself to breathe, she stepped out of the galley, her uniform suddenly feeling like a cage around her. Every set of eyes in first class was locked onto her. She had once commanded this space. Now she barely felt like she belonged in it. Nathan nodded once toward her, then turned to the Bennetts. "Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Bennett, if you have anything to say before we proceed, you have the floor." Evelyn adjusted her scarf with a slow, deliberate movement, then looked Heather in the eye. "I'd like to hear it from her first," she said smoothly. Heather's throat went dry. "Hear what?" Otis let out a small, knowing chuckle. "You know exactly what." Heather's heart pounded so loudly she could barely think. She had to say it. But how could she? How could she undo everything with just words? And even worse, would they even matter now? Heather's chest tightened as every eye in the first-class cabin bore down on her. The moment stretched unbearably, thick with expectation. She felt suffocated under the weight of her own choices, of her own assumptions. She had spent years commanding respect inside the aircraft, believing she knew how to handle any situation. But now, she was standing in front of the owners of the airline, waiting for judgment. Her mouth felt dry as she forced herself to speak. I'm sorry," she stammered. Evelyn raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "For what?" Heather's breath hitched. She had hoped those two words would be enough. But the cold sharpness in Evelyn's gaze told her otherwise. She had to own it. Heather swallowed hard, her voice shaking slightly. "I assumed you didn't belong in first class." She hesitated, feeling the words burn in her throat. "I didn't check the manifest. I didn't verify anything, I assumed." A murmur rippled through the cabin. Passengers who had been silent earlier now shifted, their discomfort evident. Some had thought the same thing Heather had. But now, with the truth laid bare, no one wanted to admit it. Otis exhaled, tilting his head slightly as if studying her. "And why do you think you assumed that?" Heather's fingers twitched at her sides. She knew why. But saying it out loud? That was something else entirely. Nathan Calloway, who had remained quiet until now, cleared his throat. "Miss Connors, if you can't answer that question, I think we already know what the answer is." Heather's face burned. Evelyn tapped a manicured nail against her armrest, waiting. "Well," Heather's pulse pounded in her ears. She wanted to say something, anything, that would justify her actions. But there was no justification. Slowly, she exhaled. "Because when I looked at you," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper, I didn't expect to see you in first class." The words landed like a hammer in the silent cabin. A slow, knowing nod from Otis. "Now that," he said, "is the first honest thing you've said all day." Heather felt her hands trembling. She had never felt small before. Not in this uniform, not in this role. But now, under the unflinching stare of the very people she had judged, she had never felt smaller. Evelyn's lips pressed together as she considered Heather's words. Then, she shook her head. "It's not enough." Heather's stomach twisted. I don't understand." Evelyn sighed, looking her dead in the eye. "An apology doesn't undo the fact that you humiliated us in front of an entire cabin full of passengers. It doesn't undo the fact that you were so sure of yourself. You called security before even bothering to check the facts." She leaned forward slightly, her voice calm but carrying weight. "So, tell me, Miss Connors, if we weren't the owners of this airline, would you even be apologizing right now?" Heather felt the air leave her lungs. She wanted to say yes. She needed to say yes, but she couldn't, because the answer was no. Evelyn didn't need to hear her say it. She already knew. Otis shifted slightly, glancing toward Nathan. "I think we've heard enough." Heather's head snapped up. "Wait." Nathan gave her a measured look. "Miss Connors, you're officially relieved of duty effective immediately. You will be escorted off the plane, and you will not be permitted to board another flight until further notice from the executive board." Heather felt the blood drain from her face. "You're suspending me." Nathan's voice didn't waver. "Indefinitely." A few gasps broke the silence from passengers who had been pretending not to listen. Heather's body went rigid. But this was a misunderstanding. A mistake. Otis let out a short, humorless laugh. "No, Miss Connors. It was a choice." Heather stood there, her entire career crumbling around her. This couldn't be happening, but it was. And from the look on Evelyn's face, she had a feeling this was only the beginning of her consequences. Heather's entire body felt numb as Nathan Calloway's words echoed in her ears. Indefinitely suspended. It didn't seem real. Her legs felt weak, her throat dry, but no one was coming to her defense. No one was telling her this was unfair, because it wasn't. Passengers were still staring, some with hidden satisfaction, others with awkward glances, as if they were witnessing something they weren't supposed to see. Heather's gaze darted to David Langley, her last hope for support. But when their eyes met, all she saw was quiet resignation. He wasn't going to save her. Mark Grayson, the security officer, stepped forward, shifting slightly as he prepared to escort her off the plane. "Miss Connors," he said, his voice neutral but firm. "Let's go." Heather's stomach churned. She wanted to argue, to fight, to fix this, but there was no way out. She turned toward Otis and Evelyn, her lips parting slightly as if she wanted to say something, anything to change the outcome. But she saw no sympathy in their eyes. Not cruelty, not gloating, just the cold weight of reality. They weren't doing this to her. She had done it to herself. With a final exhale, Heather lifted her chin, forcing her posture into something that resembled dignity. Without another word, she turned and walked toward the front of the plane. The aisle had never felt longer. She passed by Raymond Wells, who was no longer hiding the fact that he was recording. She had a sinking feeling that by the time she stepped off this aircraft, her humiliation would already be circulating online. Isla Carter, the young mother, watched her go with an unreadable expression. Heather wasn't sure if it was pity or judgment. Maybe both. She reached the exit door where Nathan Calloway stood waiting. He didn't speak, didn't look at her with anger, just disappointment. That somehow made it worse. Mark gestured toward the jet bridge. "After you." Heather stepped off the plane. The moment her feet touched the ground, she realized she had just walked away from everything. Her career, her reputation, her control. The doors behind her shut with a quiet finality, sealing her fate. Back inside the aircraft, Otis adjusted his watch, then picked up his newspaper as if nothing had happened. Evelyn took a slow sip of her tea. then placed the cup down gently, the faintest hint of a smirk on her lips. David cleared his throat, addressing the first-class cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay. We appreciate your patience and hope you enjoy the rest of your flight." Passengers slowly resumed their conversations, though the energy in the room had changed. Isla Carter glanced at Evelyn before speaking softly. "Do you think she'll learn from this?" Evelyn let out a quiet hum, tilting her head slightly. "Maybe." Otis chuckled, flipping his newspaper to the next page. "Or maybe she'll spend the rest of her life blaming everyone else." Evelyn sighed, shaking her head. "Either way, it's no longer our concern." Outside the plane, Heather walked through the airport, each step heavier than the last. She knew there was an email waiting for her, a formal notice, a final decision. She had once believed she was untouchable. Now she wasn't sure if she'd ever set foot on a plane again. Heather walked through the airport terminal in a daze, her legs feeling like lead. The murmurs of travelers around her blended into a low hum, drowned out by the rapid beating of her heart. She had walked through this airport countless times, always with a sense of authority, always in control. Now, she felt like a ghost. Her airline-issued tablet had been locked the moment she stepped off the plane. Her access to company emails, flight schedules, and employee resources, all gone. She reached the security checkpoint leading out of the restricted flight crew area, where a uniformed airport official, Eric Vasquez, stood waiting. He held a company-issued envelope in his hand, his expression unreadable. Heather stopped in front of him, swallowing hard. She knew what this was. Eric extended the envelope. "Miss Connors, this is for you." Her fingers trembled as she took it. She already knew what it would say. "Heather Connors, effective immediately, you are placed on indefinite suspension pending a formal review. You are prohibited from accessing airline facilities or operating in any capacity." Heather's breath caught in her throat. No paycheck, no flights, no crew access. Eric hesitated before speaking again. "They want you to vacate your employee locker by the end of the day." Heather's hands clenched around the envelope. "They've already decided, haven't they?" Eric didn't answer, because they had. Heather's career wasn't just on pause, it was over. She stepped past Eric, forcing herself to keep walking, her mind screaming for a way out. There had to be something, some way to fix this, but every step made it clearer. There was no fixing this. Back inside the plane, Otis and Evelyn remained seated as first-class passengers slowly gathered their belongings. The energy in the cabin had shifted. Those who had ignored the confrontation earlier now seemed eager to leave, as if wanting to escape the discomfort of witnessing consequences in real time. David Langley returned to their row, his posture more careful than before. "Mr. and Mrs. Bennett, would you like any assistance with your belongings?" Otis smiled politely. "That won't be necessary, but thank you." Evelyn adjusted her scarf, her voice calm. "You handled yourself well, David. Not everyone on this flight can say the same." David exhaled quietly. "I should have done more before it escalated." Otis gave him a knowing look. "Now you know better." David nodded, his face thoughtful. Passengers began to disembark, but the Bennetts remained seated for a moment longer. Otis glanced out the window at the jet bridge, where Heather had stood just minutes ago. Evelyn followed his gaze, then sighed. She thought she had all the power. Otis chuckled. "That's the thing about power, isn't it? It's only real if you know how to use it." Evelyn picked up her handbag, smoothing out its leather strap. "Do you think she'll try to appeal the decision?" Otis smirked. "She can try." They stood together, walking toward the exit, moving with the quiet confidence of people who knew their worth. Heather had spent years assuming she could control the rules. But today, she had learned that she never controlled anything at all. Heather walked through the terminal, her legs barely holding her up. The world around her moved at its usual hurried pace. Passengers rushing to gates, announcements echoing through the speakers, airport employees going about their routines. But for her, it all felt unreal. She clutched the envelope in her hand, her knuckles white. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. She was supposed to be in control. She had worked for years to build her career, to climb the ranks, to prove herself as one of the best. And yet, one mistake, one moment of blind assumption, had erased everything. Her breath hitched as she approached the crew lounge, the place where she had spent countless hours between flights. She had walked in and out of that room 1,000 times, chatting with coworkers, grabbing coffee, exchanging stories about unruly passengers. Now she wasn't sure she'd ever step foot inside again. When she reached the door, she hesitated. This would be the last time. She pushed it open, and a few heads turned. The room fell silent. They all knew. Her fellow flight attendants, the ones she had once laughed with, now looked at her with a mixture of pity, discomfort, and silent judgment. Some whispered behind their hands, while others quickly looked away, pretending to focus on their tablets or coffee cups. Heather swallowed hard, walking toward her locker. Her hands shook as she turned the combination lock, her mind racing. She had never been the type to hesitate. She was the one who gave orders, not the one who second-guessed herself. But today, her hands felt weak, her throat dry, her pride shattered. Just as she was pulling her belongings from the locker, a voice broke through the silence. "Heather." She turned. It was Lisa Graham, another senior flight attendant. Lisa had been with the airline even longer than Heather, a woman with years of experience and a reputation for being both fair and firm. Heather had always respected her. But now, as Lisa stood there, arms crossed, studying her with a piercing gaze, Heather felt exposed. Lisa took a step closer, lowering her voice. "I heard what happened." Heather forced a scoff, though it came out weak. "I'm sure everyone has." Lisa didn't laugh. She didn't offer words of comfort. Instead, she leaned in slightly, her tone unreadable. "I need to ask you something, Heather, and I want you to really think before you answer." Heather tensed. "What?" Lisa's eyes didn't waver. "If they weren't the owners of the airline, would you have felt bad at all?" Heather flinched, but she quickly masked it. "That's ridiculous." Lisa tilted her head slightly. "Is it?" Heather clenched her jaw, shaking her head. "I was following protocol." Lisa let out a quiet sigh. "No, you weren't. You made a decision based on who you thought they were, and you were wrong." Heather looked away. "I already admitted that." Lisa studied her for a moment before nodding. "Sure, but I don't think you actually understand what you did. And that's why you're here, clearing out your locker instead of preparing for another flight." Heather swallowed the lump in her throat. "So what? You think I deserved this?" Lisa shrugged. "It doesn't matter what I think. What matters is what you do next." Heather frowned. "Next?" Lisa sighed. "You can walk out of here blaming everyone but yourself. Or you can actually learn something from this," Heather scoffed. "And what exactly am I supposed to learn, Lisa?" Lisa's gaze hardened. "That power isn't about control. It's about responsibility. And you abused it." Heather's breath caught in her throat. Lisa straightened, her voice calm but firm. "This didn't happen to you, Heather. You did this. And until you admit that to yourself, you're never going to move forward." Heather stood frozen as Lisa turned and walked away, leaving her alone in front of her open locker. She exhaled shakily, shoving her belongings into her bag, her hands trembling. She had never felt this way before, this exposed, this vulnerable. She slammed the locker shut, gripping the strap of her bag so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She had spent years believing that she had control over everything in her domain. Now she wasn't even sure who she was anymore. Meanwhile, back in the VIP lounge, Otis and Evelyn sat comfortably in the airline's private lounge, away from the chaos of the main terminal. Their flight had landed smoothly, and now they were waiting for their car to take them to their next destination. Nathan Calloway stood in front of them, shifting slightly as he spoke. "The board has already scheduled a formal review. I doubt she'll be reinstated after this." Evelyn stirred her tea. "Good." Nathan hesitated before speaking again. Sent an email to HR before she left the airport. Otis raised an eyebrow. Oh? Nathan nodded. She requested a meeting. Said she wanted to formally discuss the events of today. Evelyn set her cup down. So she's not going down quietly. Nathan smirked. Apparently not. Otis chuckled, shaking his head. Let's see what she does next. Evelyn crossed one leg over the other, her lips curling into a knowing smile. Yes, let's see if she's really learned anything at all. Heather walked through the airport, each step feeling heavier than the last. She no longer had access to the restricted employee areas, no longer had the quiet confidence of knowing she belonged in the crew section of the terminal. Now, she was just another passenger, a passenger with nowhere to go. She found an empty seat near one of the large glass windows overlooking the runway. Outside, planes taxied. Pilots communicated with ground control, and flight attendants prepped for their next assignments. It was routine. Business as usual. For everyone except her. Her phone buzzed in her bag. She ignored it. She already knew what the notifications were. Emails from HR, messages from colleagues who had heard what happened, and possibly a few alerts from social media. Because she had no doubt that passengers had posted about what happened. She exhaled sharply, gripping the strap of her bag. It was ridiculous. It was just a mistake. She had been trying to do her job, trying to enforce order, trying to maintain the standards she had been trained to uphold. So why did it feel like she was the villain? Because deep down she knew the truth. It wasn't just a mistake. It was a choice. She had acted on an assumption, and she had been wrong. For the first time, she let herself replay the scene in her head, not from her own perspective, but from theirs. Otis and Evelyn had been seated quietly, minding their own business, doing nothing to suggest they didn't belong in first class. Yet she had approached them first. She had demanded to see their tickets. She had assumed, without checking any records, that they had no right to be there. And when they questioned her, she had escalated the situation instead of admitting the possibility that she had been wrong. Her stomach twisted. How many other times had she made that same assumption? She had prided herself on professionalism, but was it really professionalism? Or had it been power? The power to decide who stayed and who left, who followed her orders and who didn't. Lisa's words echoed in her mind. Power isn't about control. It's about responsibility. And you abused it. Heather squeezed her eyes shut, pressing her fingers against her forehead. For years, she had thought of herself as a strong leader, someone who ran her section of the plane with efficiency and authority. But now she had to ask herself, had she really been a leader? Or had she just been someone who liked being in charge? Her thoughts were interrupted by a notification on her phone. This time she glanced at it. HR meeting confirmation, 10 a.m. tomorrow. So they were giving her a chance to explain herself. She could walk in there, defend her actions, argue that she had only been following policy. She could try to convince them that she deserved another chance. But did she? For the first time, she wasn't sure. Meanwhile, in the corporate offices, Otis and Evelyn sat in a private conference room inside the airline's headquarters, overlooking the city skyline. Nathan Calloway stood at the head of the table, flipping through a folder filled with reports. The board has already reviewed the security footage, passenger complaints, and Heather Connor's employee record, Nathan explained. It's not the first time she's had a complaint against her for being overly aggressive in enforcing policy. Evelyn raised an eyebrow. Oh? And what happened to those complaints? Nathan sighed, closing the folder. They were dismissed, labeled as misunderstandings or minor customer service concerns. Otis smirked. Until it happened to the wrong passengers. Nathan nodded. Exactly. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, tapping her nails against the polished wood table. So, what's next? Do we let HR handle it, or do we make the decision ourselves? Nathan hesitated. That depends. Otis studied him. On what? Nathan sighed. On whether you want her gone completely, or if you want her to learn something from this. Evelyn tilted her head slightly. You think she's capable of learning? Nathan folded his arms. I think she's realizing just how much she lost today. Whether or not she actually learns from it, that's up to her. Otis chuckled. I've seen people in her position before. They either blame the system, or they wake up and see the truth. Evelyn smirked. I have a feeling we'll find out which one she is tomorrow. Nathan leaned against the table. If she comes in tomorrow and takes responsibility, admits that she was wrong, maybe there's a lesson in this. Maybe she walks away from this a better person. But if she walks in there with excuses, pointing fingers— Evelyn finished his sentence. Then she's exactly the person we thought she was. Otis glanced out the window, thoughtful. What's the plan? Nathan slid the folder across the table toward them. We let her speak. Evelyn lifted her teacup, blowing gently on the steam before responding. And if we don't like what she has to say? Nathan exhaled. Then she's finished. A slow smile spread across Otis's face. Good. Back at Heather's apartment, Heather sat at her small dining table, staring at the HR confirmation email. The apartment was silent, the only sound coming from the ticking clock on the wall. She had spent years working toward this career. Now, in less than 24 hours, she would find out if she still had a future at the airline. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, debating whether she should prepare a statement, write an email, or call someone for advice. But none of it seemed right. For the first time in her life, she didn't know what to say, because the truth was staring her right in the face. She had judged Otis and Evelyn before they even spoke. She had let her assumptions define her actions, and now she was paying the price. Tomorrow she would walk into that meeting and say whatever she needed to say. But the question was, would she say the truth, or would she try to save herself with more lies? Heather barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she replayed the moment on the plane. The way she had stood over Otis and Evelyn Bennett, so sure of herself, so convinced that she was right. She could still hear their voices, steady and controlled, while her own had been filled with impatience and authority. She turned in bed, staring at the dim glow of her alarm clock. 5:12 a.m. In a few hours, she would be sitting in front of the airline's executive board, fighting for her career. Or maybe not fighting at all. She had spent hours crafting a speech in her head, a defense of her actions, an argument that she had simply been following protocol. But every time she pieced it together, the words sounded empty, because she knew the truth. She hadn't followed protocol. She had ignored it. She had made a snap judgment, acted on a bias she hadn't even realized she carried, and humiliated two people who had done nothing wrong. And those two people just happened to be the ones who could decide whether she ever worked in this industry again. Her stomach twisted as she finally forced herself to get up. If this meeting was her last chance, then she had to decide. Was she going to lie to save herself, or was she going to tell the truth, no matter what happened? The HR meeting. By the time Heather arrived at the corporate offices, she felt like she was walking to her own execution. The front desk attendant barely acknowledged her, typing something into her computer before gesturing toward the elevator. 3rd floor, conference room 2. Heather nodded stiffly and made her way inside. The elevator ride was painfully slow, every second stretching into eternity. When the doors finally opened, Nathan Calloway was already waiting outside the conference room. His expression was unreadable. "Heather," he said, gesturing for her to enter. Inside, the room was quiet. Otis and Evelyn Bennett sat at the long glass table, their posture as composed as ever. Beside them, 2 other board members watched with neutral expressions. A seat sat empty at the other end of the table, waiting for her. Heather swallowed hard and took her place. Nathan sat down last, folding his hands in front of him. "Miss Connors, we're giving you an opportunity to explain yourself before we make our final decision. You know the details of what happened on that flight, so I won't repeat them. The question now is simple. Why did you do what you did?" Heather felt the eyes of everyone in the room pressing into her. She had spent the entire night thinking about this moment, thinking about the right answer to save her career. But now, sitting in front of Otis and Evelyn Bennett, She knew there was only one answer. The truth. She took a shaky breath. I assumed you didn't belong in first class. The room remained silent, waiting. Heather forced herself to continue. I didn't check the manifest. I didn't verify your seats. I made a decision based on what I saw, and I was wrong. Otis tilted his head slightly. Go on. Heather exhaled. I called security because I was convinced I was right. I escalated the situation instead of fixing it. I was so sure of my own authority that I didn't stop to consider that I might be the problem. She hesitated before adding, and if you weren't the owners of the airline, I don't think I ever would have realized how wrong I was. Evelyn's lips twitched slightly, though her expression remained composed. Honest. Finally. Heather felt a lump rise in her throat. I can't undo what I did, and I won't make excuses for it. I was wrong. Nathan exchanged a look with the board members before turning back to Otis and Evelyn. Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Bennett, you asked to be here for this. What's your recommendation? Otis leaned forward, his fingers intertwined. Heather, let me ask you something. If you were given another chance, would you actually change? Heather swallowed. Yes. Otis raised an eyebrow. How can we believe that? Heather met his gaze, her voice steady for the first time since she walked in. Because I'm not the same person who stepped onto that plane 2 days ago. I used to think power meant control, meant proving that I was in charge. But I was wrong. Power means responsibility, and I failed at that responsibility. Evelyn tapped a manicured nail against the table. And if we decide that you shouldn't work for this airline anymore? Heather inhaled sharply. Then I'll accept that, but I won't forget what I've learned. A heavy silence filled the room. Nathan looked at Otis and Evelyn. Final decision? Otis exhaled slowly, then nodded. She's not flying anytime soon. She needs time to reflect on this. But I'm not interested in ruining her life. Evelyn studied Heather for a long moment before speaking. Suspension, 6 months. Mandatory bias training. And if we hear about anything like this again, she's done. No second review. Heather's breath hitched. 6 months. It wasn't career-ending. It was a chance, a real one. Nathan nodded. Understood. He turned back to Heather. Miss Connors, you'll receive an official letter from HR confirming your suspension. You won't be allowed on any flights in any capacity for the next 6 months. After that, you'll be reevaluated. Heather blinked rapidly, trying to process everything. Thank you. Otis gave her a long, knowing look. Don't thank us. He stood, adjusting his jacket. Show us that you deserve it. Evelyn rose beside him, smoothing her dress. And if I were you, Heather, she said with a small smile, I'd take this time to figure out who you really are. Heather sat frozen as the two of them left the room, their presence lingering even after they were gone. Nathan stood next, motioning toward the door. Meeting's over. You know what to do. Heather slowly rose, gripping the edge of the table for support. She had walked into this room expecting the worst. Instead, she had walked away with something she never thought she would get. A second chance. As she stepped into the hallway, she took a deep breath, feeling lighter for the first time in years. She had lost her power, her control, and the certainty she once carried. But maybe, just maybe, she had gained something even more valuable. That's the story. What do you think? Did she deserve a second chance? Or should she have lost her job for good? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this. Also, share this video with your friends and family. See you in the next one.